Hey everyone, I'm Gavin,
I'm Ryan.
and this is the S.O.U.N.D Project. Okay, so today we're going to mix it up a little bit, and we're going to do a case study of a former project. We typically will show the end result, and you'll see nice photos or a video that we've done on our YouTube channel, but it doesn't allow us to go into the details as much as it would be in a case study and kind of show how we got there. So we're going to try that today.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be interesting for people, and as we go through it too, if anybody has questions, please comment, and you can also send us an email at info@haversickdesigns.com and learn more information about this project in particular if it's something that resonates with you. But the one we're going to talk about today is Oak Hollow Recording in Oregon City, Oregon.
Yep.
And it's a really great project. We actually just released a YouTube video of this project where we flew out to Oregon City and met with Lauren King, who is the owner of Oak Hollow, and walked through this beautiful studio. I mean, it's one of the ones that we did pretty early on in the business. I think that we started the project maybe in 2013, and then we ended up finishing it about 2015 or 16 or so. And what it was a shed, honestly. Like he contacted me, he reached out and said, I've got this space. I bought this house. I'm really excited about putting in a really nice studio in my backyard. And he was working with Mike Peacock from Sweetwater, and Mike introduced him to us, and he just started off with an email and shared some photos of what he had, and it's essentially about 47 feet by 23 feet. The ceiling height was about 10.5 feet to the ceiling joists that we had to work with, which is a great amount of space to work with, honestly. Like some people, they don't have nearly that amount, and it's something where they're always trying to get more headroom or a bigger footprint. But 47 by 23 is a nice space, and he wanted to add in a control room, a live room, and an ISO booth, and also have room for a lounge. And on the initial call, he also does a lot of woodworking, and so he said that he would like to integrate a small workshop in there as well. Sure. So those were kind of the goals. This one was one that actually got it into Mix Magazine's class of 2015. It made the cut for that, where they just picked the best studios of the year, and this was one of them. And like I mentioned before, we had a YouTube video that if you want to see the visuals of the finished product and an interview with Lauren and rundown of the gear and everything like that, you can check that out. Yeah. You've checked it out, right?
Yeah, I have.
Good.
A couple of times.
All right, so next thing we're going to go through here is just want to share some photos of what Lauren sent me to begin with. Sure. And it was, like I said, it was a shed. It from the outside it just looks like a wood shack. It's and honestly, it doesn't look a whole lot different than that now. It's something where he wanted it to be something that was a little, off the beaten path and not something that people could tell this is a high-end studio. It's just in his backyard and kind of low key. But it's got some wood sliders there that ended up getting removed. The inside of it's hilarious. It's just a wood shack with dirt floors and a bunch of toys in there. Honestly, like when Lauren first reached out, I was not sure how serious he was. Like sometimes, you just never know. And he said, I want this studio to be top end, the best it can be. But it's awesome to see photos like this as the starting point. Again, just dirt floor, pretty much a blank canvas. Yeah. And so from there, we started off just doing some layouts of the room. And that's always like a starting point for us before we go into too much detail as far as how things are constructed and doing section details and everything of the space. We have to come up with a layout. And a lot of times we get a little bit of direction from the client, but sometimes, as like you're talking to people on the phone, there's like, we trust you and just go for it.
Sure.
So that this was the first layout that we started with, and notice that it has a control room in there that's about 136 square feet, a live room that's 378 square feet, and then there's a little entrance lounge and an airlock in between the rooms. And to be honest, when I did this first layout, I was not super happy with it, because one thing that was kind of holding me back a little bit was this wood shop that needed to go in there as well. So it's about 381 square feet. Lauren has a lot of tools, and you need space in a workshop to be able to do all the woodworking, and so it ate up quite a bit, almost a third of the space inside the shed. So that was our first layout, and with any layout process that we go through, it's pretty rare, honestly, that the first layout that we send is like the winner. Like there's been a few of those, where people are excited to see the first one and we just nail it because it just lays out. Honestly, Josh Dunn's studio that we just did a YouTube video for as well, it just fit like a puzzle piece to where everything was, the vocal booth, of course it goes there. It just makes sense. This one was, when it's a open canvas, it's a little harder to come up with. So.
On this, how did you decide where the initial rooms were going to go on this first layout?
There's a few things that we had to consider. One was the shop. He wanted it to be on the end that's closest to his house, and so we had that on that end. We honestly, a little bit of this was just let me throw something out there and have you react to it, and that's the case with a lot of jobs. Is just we put our best foot forward, but knowing that feedback from the client is really important for us to take the next step. When we switch to option 2, the control room is now set at an angle to where it's not going straight back and forth like it was in option 1. And the reason for this is to increase sight lines. Because if I go back to option 1, notice that the window on the front wall of the control room, you're only going to see a certain amount of that live room. Like you're not going to be able to physically see into the rest of the space that's on the south side of this drawing. And so by switching the angle and moving it to an angled view into the live room, we're able to see more areas. We actually added some more windows as well, and put in that vocal booth there, which was something that kind of came in discussions where he wanted a vocal booth as well. Still have a little bit of an entrance lounge. The wood shop is still the same size, but I think it was just a much better use of the space that we had. Moving on to option 3, you'll see here also I started to add sight lines to the layouts, so you could see what you could see in each of the rooms. And so anything hatched out in red there is something that you could physically see from the mixed position in the control room. The control room is now moved on the other side of the space, and we still have like a vocal booth, which in this layout didn't have good sight lines. We could have put a glass door in there and be able to see into the vocal booth that way, but we just very early on, and we weren't thinking through that step yet of how we're going to see into that vocal booth. Sometimes people also use cameras just to go from space to space. But notice wood shop is still 384 square feet. Option 4, really the main difference here is we actually removed the vocal booth. The only difference between this one and the one before was removing that vocal booth. And I think it was in an attempt to get more space in the live room, which is how that conversation started moving with the wood shop. Is just like, man, this wood shop's taken up a lot of our space. Really would like to have more space in the live room. Let's cut the vocal booth, which unfortunately is something that hurt the studio in favor of the wood shop. And I think that kind of got Lauren's brain thinking a little bit, because as you'll see, we moved to the next one here. That shop got a little smaller. It's 312 square feet now instead of 384, and the vocal booth is back. And because I could start to tell that Lauren was thinking, man, if I'm doing all of this, I should get what I want on the studio side of things. And he even mentioned to me at one point, he was like, if this really keeps going, I could always put a wood shop somewhere else on my property. And so, but this layout's getting closer to where we ended up. This is layout 5. But notice layout 6, the wood shop is completely gone. And that was where that conversation really came to a head, where Lauren's just like, man, I would rather make this studio as good as it can possibly be, instead of trying to cram in a wood shop into a studio building. So in this case, the wood shop went away. We were able to move the control room a little east on this drawing, still at that angle to get some good sight lines into the various rooms, but it also gave us the ability to have a bigger lounge and an entrance area. The other thing that got added on this one, which there were some of the earlier ones, I didn't call it out, but some of the earlier ones had a bathroom in the kind of northwest corner of the drawing. And so we have that there, and running plumbing to that location was kind of easy compared to other places in the building. But it's always nice to have a bathroom in the studio. It means that people wouldn't have to go into his house to use the restrooms, the facilities. So, but yeah, so it was nice when the shop went away, honestly, because it opened up some design elements that we didn't have before.
Sure. At this stage, how much are you thinking about the acoustic properties of the space opposed to just the logistical properties of the space?
It kind of all goes together.
Sure.
It's one of those things where if we are not thinking about the acoustics and just worrying about the layout only, someone could really resonate and like something that acoustically wouldn't work.
Sure.
So a lot of times what we're doing is shaping the rooms. And I remember early on we were doing some ray tracing of the control room shape and dialing that in, and it evolved even from what's shown here in option 6. But I am thinking about the acoustics. That's why that control room being angled like that, it also pokes into the live room and creates some angled walls, so it breaks up flutter echo into the live room, and notice how the vocal booth is not parallel on the side walls, like where those doors are located at. So there's definitely thought that goes into that, but it's not to the full extreme that we go after the layout's finalized.
Right.
Yeah.
When the shop was still a possibility in the space, how worried was Lauren about the isolation between like the studio and the shop, or did he know he'd only be using one or the other at the time?
It was more the latter, where he was like, I'm the one who's doing the woodworking, and so. But that's a good point. When sometimes people have a sound sensitive room next to their studio, but someone else could be using it at the same time they're using their studio, then they really have to consider how much isolation we do there.
Right.
Our isolation on this project was more concerned about him disturbing his neighbors or his neighbors disturbing him, like if they're cutting their grass or doing something in their yard, that it would then interrupt a recording. So, but yeah, good question. It's the wood shop. He was just like, man, sometimes we'll design studios for people and their master bedroom is directly above their studio.
Yeah.
And if they're single, they're like, it doesn't matter because I'm going to be in the studio and not sleeping at the time. But if they have a family, then it's things that we really have to make sure that we take care of.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So the next thing here is we'll go to option 7. And option 7, we kind of flipped the vocal booth on the other side there. We have an airlock, actually it wasn't an airlock at this point. It was just a machine storage room that was down there at the bottom to be able to put some loud equipment. And but again, it wasn't quite there, and then we ended up with option 8, which was the final one. And it took a while to get there. You can see the sight lines are great in this space because you've got nice windows leading into the live room and the vocal booth, which is now on the left side of the engineer. But then we used the machine room as an airlock to kind of go from the control room into the live room, and still gave us nice space inside of the lounge. The lounge shrunk a little bit, but it's just, it takes some time. 8 layouts is a lot, and that represents probably a month or two of going back and forth with Lauren and getting him what he wanted.
Yeah.
But it was well worth it because this layout, compared to if we just went with the very first layout that we started with, he would have ended up having a wood shop that maybe later on he'd want to renovate and tear that out and put in more rooms, and it just wouldn't have worked as well as if we did that due diligence at the beginning.
Sure. And I know that we talk about this in some of our isolation episodes, but do you want to talk about why that air gap is so important between the control room and the live room?
Oh yeah, this airlock. So the airlock, you can build these really nice walls, and you'll see some details here in Lauren's space of how we built the walls. But a lot of times your weak links end up being doors, doors or windows. And so in order to get the performance that you want, a lot of times you have to have two doors. And that can be done in a communicating door system where you have a single wall and there's two doors in it, and one swings in and one swings out. And then you can get that double door system to perform similar to the way the wall is performing. If you just put a single door in a double wall system, you don't get the full benefit of what you could have when it comes to transmission loss of that wall system. So this airlock, the nice thing is there's one door in the control room you open up to then walk into the airlock, and then you have another door that then goes into the live room and a big airspace in between them. So you can be playing drums in that live room and not hear it in the control room, or it's at least very, very minimal to where you can monitor at a decent level in the control room and not interfere with your recordings. So yeah, good question. It's anytime you can have mass separated by a big airspace, you're going to get better results.
Right. And this is one that we went through 8 different revisions of the just the layout. So how often do we do that many versus how many times do we get it on the first try?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that it's usually within 2 or 3. Like usually within 2 or 3, we're ended up getting it. And this is a unique case because of that wood shop, because most of those things were us trying to fit a studio in around a workshop rather than the other way around, where the studio is the main goal. So.
And so that's something that I know when I'm on initial calls with clients, that them knowing when it's just an open shell and pretty much an open canvas for us to figure out what the layout's going to be, that it gives a lot of confidence to the client, knowing that, okay, if I don't like this initial layout, either logistically or acoustically, that it can be changed.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's something where we're not designing for us. Again, it's like we always say that, like, we don't design these studios for us. We design them for the people that are using them. And what I might want logistically in my studio and how it flows and sight lines and all those things doesn't mean anything, honestly. It's something where the client is what matters, and in conversations with them, these things come out, and it allows us to really make it what works for them.
Sure.
So the next thing that we did, once we had this layout solidified, we started doing ray tracing of the control room. And ray tracing there's software available where you can place a speaker and place a microphone in a room, and you can actually see how sound is going to bounce around the room and how the geometry of the room is going to affect how that sound returns to the listener. And you'll notice the shape of the control room is pretty particular. It's not a rectangular box at all. It's got a lot of wall angles to it. And this first diagram that I have on the screen right now is the first order reflections in the room. And we've got not very many first reflection points here, just because we have all these angles in the space. But if we go to second order reflections, is first and second order reflections, you can see how things are bouncing around the room and how those angled sidewalls are helping to guide that energy towards the back. And we wanted to do that because it's easier for us to treat the back of the room with bass trapping and things like that, because the front of the room has a lot of glass, honestly. And that's the reason we needed to angle everything the way that we did, is because it's a reflective surface, and the sound that skips off of it needs to go elsewhere to be tamed.
Sure.
And so if you even go to first, second, and third order reflections, it gets kind of complicated. But notice how a lot of that energy is getting pushed towards the back of the room, especially where that bass trap is in the back of the control room. And I'll show you how that was handled here in a little bit. But it's something where we do this with all projects, where we're trying to figure out how the geometry of the space is going to either help or hurt. Now, when we're designing a space from the ground up, we're able to just, figure out the best adjustments to make sure that it's aiding in a positive way.
Right.
Sometimes we're just given a geometry that we're stuck with. Like, this is what we have to work with, and we got to make it happen. So in that case, the ray tracing is more beneficial to figure out where the problems are versus trying to optimize an existing space or a new space that we're going to be doing.
So for those that may be newer to acoustics, do you want to explain like what the first, second, and third order reflections are?
Sure, yeah. So what it is that first order reflections are going to be where it just bounces off of one surface and comes back to the listener. And typically these are going to be the strongest reflections because every time sound hits a surface, it gets reduced in energy by a little bit. But if it's only bouncing off of one surface, it's going to be probably the strongest reflections that you have to deal with.
Right.
In a rectangular room, a lot of times you see it off the side walls, the floor, the ceiling, and the back wall is where you're going to get the most of them. You can also get it off of the front wall as well. So basically, it's bouncing off of one surface, coming back to your ears, and usually it's interfering with that direct sound and skewing things so that your frequency response isn't as good as you'd like it to be.
Sure.
A lot of times what ends up happening is comb filtering. You'll see like a lot of sharp peaks and dips in the high frequency range of a frequency response graph, and a lot of that is due to these first order reflections are coming back slightly delayed with the direct sound and causing issues. So we either want to guide that energy away or we want to treat it. And with the appropriate acoustical materials, whether that be diffusion or absorption or bass trapping, anything like that. So second order reflections are going to bounce off of two surfaces. So it hits one surface, another surface, and then comes back to the listener. And then third order reflections are hitting three surfaces. And you can keep going and going because sound is just going to bounce around the room. But the first, second, and third order reflections are going to be the ones that are the strongest and the ones that are hardest to deal with.
Sure.
And so once you've taken care of first, second, and third order reflections in your room, you're not going to have to worry about the fourth, fifth, and sixth because it's already being absorbed at those points.
Right.
Yeah. All right, so the next step after all this planning, we have to get to a point where, some construction happens. And I remember we did some conduit layouts for Lauren and showed him where we have to get audio from room to room, right? After you're building these airtight, waterproof boxes, these little rooms, but we got to get cables to go from room to room so we can plug in mics and get audio from space to space. And so we sent him conduit layouts and showed him how we're going to pop up in different rooms. And since we had a dirt floor to start with, we could just dig down below that and run all the conduit underneath the earth, you know. And our plan was to put a concrete floor in. And so once you do this, you get one shot to do it, right? And so I remember having lots of conversations with Lauren about making sure that these pop-up locations where the conduit would run was exactly where it needed to be, because if it ended up being inside of where the walls are, then that doesn't work. We wanted it to pop up just inside of the walls, outside of the walls, within the interior of the room, so that we could put mic plates surface mounted rather than recessed into the wall.
Sure.
And that was for isolation purposes. We don't want to build these great walls and then just poke a bunch of holes in it for electrical and also for mic plates. So you'll see here, it took a lot of work on his end. And I do want to mention too that Lauren, it took 2 years to build this place, and mostly because it's not his full-time job. Like he's a project manager at a construction company. He also happens to be lucky enough to have every band member that he has is a contractor. And so they ended up just building it themselves. And you'll see towards the end that they're really great craftsmen, and it's every attention to detail was there. But it just took a long time because they just did it on nights and weekends when they had things free.
Sure.
So I remember talking with Lauren, and they just went through so many different measurements, and just the whole measure twice, cut once is probably like measure 50 times and then place your conduit once, because they just really wanted to make sure that everything was done properly, so that they didn't. Once the concrete goes in, you're kind of stuck with that. So they got everything down perfectly of where we wanted it to be placed, and then the next step was bring in that concrete truck, and so. This was a big day for Lauren, because it was. I think this was probably where it started to become really real, because before that it was just kind of placing conduits, and then like, man, we're pouring concrete. This is happening. So the concrete was poured, and you'll see in this next photo here is that you'll see these PVC piping that pop up in different locations, and all of these are I think actually what you're seeing here. The one closest to you is the control room location. Then then we have the machine room location on the right, and then you have one of the live room locations on the far left. And so all these spots had to pop up exactly where we wanted them to. Because the other thing that we did was we did a double wall system in here, but the first thing we needed to do was cut the concrete slab. And so you'll see this image on the screen now is that that's that general shape of that control room that you saw in some of the diagrams. But we cut the concrete and made sure that we had each room on its own separate slab, honestly. And we wanted to make sure that we got the isolation as good as possible doing it that way. And the thing with that is that we ended up cutting all the way through the concrete with that. It's because you don't want to cut down just a couple inches, because then the low frequencies will still vibrate through the concrete and pop up. And so you actually have to take a saw and cut all the way through the slab to dirt, essentially. Yeah. And so that was a big day, making sure we get all the angles right, because, again, we then have to come in here and build walls.
Yep. And this is perfect. This and the Conduit are both perfect examples as to why it's so important to do the work on the front end for the layout, because if we didn't have that layout, trying to figure out where Conduit needed to go for, a mic plate or something like that, or figuring out where do we need to cut the concrete so that the dimensions are exactly right for that room to isolate it properly, This is where all of that work pays off.
Yeah, and this is why it's good to have good contractors, honestly. Because we can design that plan, but then someone's got to execute it. And Lauren and his friends, his bandmates, they were all very skilled, and they could pull something like this off. But if you're not building it yourself, then you got to pick a contractor that really knows what they're doing, because you can see it's a little mistake could really take us down the wrong path at this stage.
Yeah, something as simple as just not cutting the concrete all the way through can really injure your isolation needs.
Absolutely, yeah. It's something that we gotta consider. So the next step here is we have double walls. So each room was built as a room within a room. So it had its own walls, and then it had new ceiling joists resting on top of those walls. So nothing was physically touching that wood shed that we had before. It's like everything is free floating. And you'll see here in this photo I'm showing now is that it's a 2x4 studded wall with a 1-inch air gap, and then another 2x4 studded wall. And the neat thing is that 1-inch air gap lines up perfectly with the cut concrete that's below it. So that cut concrete is right in between there, and these walls were built on either side of that cut. And you'll see all the windows are framed in at this stage. I have another view here of the live room looking into the control room. And a lot of framing, making sure we get the angles right, but then also making sure there's no short circuits between those independent walls, because you want them to just operate completely independently from each other.
Right.
The next step is not the fun step. It's probably the something that most studio owners don't look forward to if they're doing it themselves. But it's insulation, and insulation is important. We got to make sure that we're not creating these small drum heads inside of your wall. Essentially, if you left it hollow, and then you could probably hear this on walls. A lot of times you just pound your fist on a wall that doesn't have any insulation, you hear a tone, and it's like a kick drum. And so we have to insulate it, and that increases our isolation. And he used a mineral wool insulation, probably wearing eye protection and gloves and long sleeve shirts and all that, because I've done this before, insulating rooms like this, and you itch for weeks if you don't take the precautions. So that's not a fun day, but it's an important one. The next thing was the delivery of the mass-loaded vinyl material. So mass-loaded vinyl is a 1/8 of an inch thick material that weighs about a pound per square foot. It's very heavy, and it helps with blocking low-frequency sounds in particular, and because it adds a lot of mass, but also it's a resilient material that helps to decouple a little bit between layers. Sure. So this actually material comes on rolls, and not the most easy thing to install, honestly. Like it's worth it to do, but have you ever installed drywall before yourself?
Drywall, yes. I have.
So drywall's not fun to begin with, and then also on the ceiling. Imagine you have to put drywall on the ceiling is very difficult. Now use the same amount of mass or a little bit more potentially but then make it flexible. You know, that's it makes it really, really difficult to install the mass loaded vinyl. And so a lot of times people will put up their first layer of drywall, and then they'll put up mass loaded vinyl and then do a final layer of drywall. Usually a lot of times it's sandwiched in between a couple layers.
Sure.
And sometimes people will put that layer of mass loaded vinyl down on the back side of the drywall before they put up the final layer, so they're just doing one layer up there. There's no way around it. It's not an easy process, and you got to seal all the seams as well with silicone caulking, and it's just a pain to do sometimes. But at the end of the day, it's we actually have some photos of them installing the mass loaded vinyls up there first, and they're putting the final layer of drywall over top of that, and it's something where I've experienced the isolation in this space. It did its job, and it's really working. But again, not an easy step. Now we had a few photos here of just the studio is almost finished as far as the drywall is concerned. The windows aren't in yet, but you see the saw that's in the control room right now while he's doing the finishing touches. The accent wall in the live room was really fun to help him design, and we wanted to add some natural wood into the live room, and just gives it kind of like a warmth and musicality to the sound quality in there.
Sure.
And it's a nice feature wall too, like it's the one you look at when you're sitting at the mix position, and so kind of have this little up and down pattern with the wood there that turned out really, really nice, and it was allowing us to then carry that into other elements of the design, which we didn't know at the time, but then once we started designing the interior treatments, we had that kind of zigzag pattern in mind.
So at this point, what would you say as far as timeline wise? Because I know that they weren't necessarily doing this full time, like it was on nights and weekends when they had time.
Yeah.
But how long do you think it took them to get to this stage in the project?
I mean, I think that this was, if I remember correctly, it was probably about 15 months in or so, like over a year.
Sure.
There's a lot of elements that we ended up doing custom treatment inside of the room, and that took a long time too. But this was probably over a year, so over 50% of the time it took them to complete it. Then we've got the control room looking into the live room here, and good sight lines. You can see that into each one of these spaces. So now we're going to move into talking about interior acoustical treatment. So they got the isolation down, the windows are in, and they're ready to go, but now the rooms sound horrible, and that's the one thing that the clients, a lot of times, once they finish the isolation piece and the drywall's done, they walk into their room and they're just like, we've made a huge mistake. Like this is awful. Yeah. But it's kind of a two-step process because of that. You're trying to isolate sound and block it, but then you're trying to make it sound good, and it's two different things altogether. And so usually the room will sound really bad once you finish with isolation, and now it's time to design a cool treatment package for them.
Yep.
One thing I'll start with is this bass trap that we did in the back of the control room. So the back of the control room kind of came to a peak. You saw in some of the original diagrams, and we wanted to make use of that space, and so we filled it completely with insulation, and we were able to then also work in a mass loaded vinyl layer that's shown in green here on this diagram that was not touching the insulation at all, so it had the ability to flex, and if you want to have a membrane absorber in your system, it needs to be able to freely move. Like you can't have it packed up with insulation, or else it's not going to move and do its job as well as it could. But then there's also a framed out wall there that holds in some diffusers, and originally we had spec'd out some RPG omnifusers that you see on this diagram. We ended up switching that along the process to some overtone acoustics diffusers that Lauren went with. And so it was just a really nice use of this real estate that back there it would have gotten awkward with any furniture or things that you would put back there.
Sure.
And I selfishly just wanted it for a bass trap. I wanted the room to perform really well for Lauren, and so we captured that with a bass trap. Looking at a top view of the room, this was showing some of the different elements, kind of early stages in the design, but you see the blue around the perimeter of the room. That's a soffit bass trap, and we utilize these in a lot of our studios. Basically, if you only treat the vertical corners of your room, you're only handling one of the three types of tangential modes that could be problematic in your room.
Sure.
And so with this, the horizontal corners between the walls and the ceiling, that's something that's really beneficial to help with your low end issues. And it's also a place where you typically don't have anything going on. You know, like it's not something that's going to interfere with a lot of lighting or a ceiling fan or anything like that. Like these wall ceiling junctures are pretty much free most of the time. Sure. Might as well make them work for you.
Right.
And so we have got that element in there. We also have a ceiling cloud above his mix position that was kind of unique because Lauren had mentioned to me that if a lot of times he's recording by himself, you know, and the idea of arming a track and then going to a live room and setting everything up and then hitting record. And he's like, man, if I'm just going to be doing acoustic guitar, I want my control room to sound really great for that as well.
Right.
And you can do that. You just have to kind of plan ahead. And so that ceiling cloud there that's in green, the first portion of it that hits the first reflection point off the ceiling, that first skip off the ceiling, that's absorption. But then at one point, once you get past the first reflection point, it switches to a wood slatted cloud, which is more diffusive in nature. And so if he's sitting in his mix position, but then he turns around in his chair, he can play his guitar. He's facing the rear wall diffusers, and he's got diffusion above him. It just sounds really great for acoustic guitar. So it's a nice way that we could give him what he wanted in both aspects, like both for mixing and for tracking. The other element that's shown here is in orange. It's the ceiling cloud above the couch in the back of the room, and that was just helpful to make that experience for anyone that's listening back there. Obviously, they're not going to get the full accuracy of the mix position,
Sure.
but you want to make it good for people that are hanging out in the back and listening. Some of the details here we have in our live room. These are some elevation drawings of some 4-inch thick absorption panels, but then also some hybrid panels, which are absorptive, but then have those wood slats over top of it. And you can see it's in kind of that V shape that feature wall of the live room had. We also have some corner bass trapping in there and just trying to make it so that it's not too dead, but it's still controlled and lively enough to be able to make drums. And Lauren does a lot of like bluegrass and acoustic instruments. Want to make sure that room really would sing for that, and so we didn't want to over absorb things. The next thing here is the ceiling clouds in the live room, which is a great feature of this room. The idea is that I wanted these ceiling clouds to kind of emanate from the mix position in the control room in a completely different room, to have it kind of shine out into the live room, and the kind of rays of light and like sunbeams is kind of what I was going for here. And we had done a bunch of different designs for the ceiling clouds for Lauren, and this was the one that was the most out there as far as like different than all the rest of them.
Sure.
However, it was also the one that I thought was the coolest, and luckily Lauren thought so as well. Yep. And so the neat thing about these ceiling clouds is that they're absorptive or diffusive, depending on where you're at. There's wood slats on some of them, just standard absorption in other places. And it allows him to be able to move instruments around the room and just like change the way that it sounds. And it was cool to be there recently when we filmed the YouTube video, because I was able to walk around the room and hear that difference that was only in modeling and on a computer program before that.
Sure.
I had not physically visited since it had been completed. But it just sounds beautiful in there. And notice how that northeast corner of the diagram, it's more diffusive there than anything, because that's where we wanted to put the drums. And so the drums always live there, or most of the time they live there. But it gives them the freedom to move things around as needed.
In the full studio tour video, this was one of those things that I know you had talked about it before, but that was the first time that I had actually seen an example of how this was set up. Yeah. And aesthetically, it looks awesome, but then it's also very functional. So that's a really cool feature of the studio.
Yeah, I love it. It's really nice. It obviously much harder to pull off than just a bunch of rectangles on the ceiling, but in the end, it was definitely worth it.
Yeah.
So I want to show some details too of that bass trap in the corner of the of the control room. Notice how it's framed out a little bit with just some wood framing on the sides, but then we cut the mineral fiber. I say we a lot. I didn't do any of this. Like, I didn't cut any insulation. I didn't frame up anything. But yeah, we added this mineral fiber into the corner of the room and stacked it up to the ceiling. And having all of that resistance, because absorption works in the form of a friction loss, and it's small amounts of heat that gets absorbed because sound is trying to fight through these insulation porous materials. It gets absorbed in little amounts of heat, and so we have a lot of resistance here when we put in that much insulation. Notice on the floor of this photo as well, the mass loaded vinyl's already been stretched on the wood frame that would then get pushed into place, and this next photo shows that. So we really had to make sure that insulation, again, did not touch that mass-loaded vinyl because it's a membrane absorber. And even the insulation that got added into the cavities here in this next photo had to make sure that it was brought out far enough so it didn't touch the mass-loaded vinyl either. Yep. And so it was really important to get all those details right, and because all it would take is just a little bit of pressure on that mass-loaded vinyl, and it wouldn't be able to flex the way that we want it to.
Sure. Is that something that you have to worry about changing over time, that the insulation may get closer to that mass-loaded vinyl?
Yeah, what we do in that case is a lot of times we either screw it into place, or sometimes we'll even put in like a chicken wire or some sort of strapping that would stop it from sagging and pushing into that. But that's a great question, because things change over time. Like, these studios are around for years and years, and you don't want to make sure that doesn't sag, and then 10 years down the road your studio doesn't sound as good as it did before.
Right.
Yeah, good question. All right, the next thing we're going to show is the soffit traps around the perimeter of the control room. And these are, like I said, we do this in a lot of studios. They're easy to pull off. You just take some 2x2 framing, frame it out away from the wall, then fill it with insulation, and then you wrap that with fabric. And it ends up looking like an architectural detail, but it's working for you acoustically. So that's a great way to grab some additional low end in your space. The next one here is the ceiling cloud of the control room, and this is the one that had some wood slats on it in some areas, and then just absorption others. But then we also needed to work in some recessed lights. And recessed lights are great in studios, and they look amazing, but you can't just poke holes through your drywall. You need to do it in the treatment. And so we'll work it into clouds, and we'll work it into soffit base traps. And I think that these recessed lights were pulled off wonderfully by the contractors here. You see all the framing that was necessary to get that done, and then the stretch fabric was then tucked in there to make it just look like they're recessed into drywall, but it's into fabric. The rear wall cloud here is the next photo. Notice there's a return duct there above there, and so we had to frame out for that. And then it kind of came out and away from that rear wall base trap. The next photo here shows the insulation filling that main ceiling cloud of the control room, and you'll see in white there's some channels that are installed, and that's how we get the fabric to look really tight and clean in these spaces. Is we use these plastic extruded channels that have teeth that grip fabric, and it allows you to then tuck the fabric in place, and the more you tuck it in, the more taut the fabric gets, and it ends up looking really clean. It's much easier to do it with this than it would be to staple it in place, because those staples can come loose over time. If the fabric comes loose with a stretch fabric system, it's really easy just to take the tuck tool and tuck it in further, and it stretches it tight again. So it's really kind of the preferred way to do it, because at the end of the day, it ends up looking like this on the bottom of that cloud. Those ceiling lights are built into there, and it just looks seamless. Like, it's really, really, really nice. One thing before we go to kind of the finished photos of the room, which everyone always likes to see, I wanted to talk about the equipment list. I mean, I know a lot of people that probably are watching are interested in gear, and Lauren's got a lot of it. He's got a lot of cool material, cool equipment in his space. He has the SSL Matrix for his console, and that was something that Mike Peacock at Sweetwater, talked with Lauren about figuring out what was the best fit for him, and happened to be Mike also owned an SSL Matrix, so it was easy for him to kind of talk back and forth with Lauren about that. That's kind of the centerpiece of the studio. He's now has has the ATC SCM 25As for his monitors. Before that, I believe he had Dyne Audio speakers, but he ended up switching over to an ATCs like probably a year or two after the studio was completed.
Nice.
And is really enjoying those monitors. And so I won't go through the list of everything, but I'll leave this up on the screen for a little bit for people to see. He's got a great collection of microphones.
He does. And we really touch on that in the video too. Like he really goes through the mic locker that he's got, and it's an impressive collection he's got going already.
Yeah, it's really, really nice. And so obviously all of this gear, he's got really high-end gear. It needs to be in a space that sounds great, because you could have all this gear, but then you have, all sorts of room mode issues, and your mixes don't translate, or your live room is too reverberant, and you can't get clean recordings. So acoustics really helps this gear, shine and work to its fullest potential. Mm-hmm. So next photo, I just want to remind everybody what we started with. It's one of the best transformations I've seen, when it comes to going from this to this. And just an amazing space. Like, I really wish I had enough room in my backyard to build something like this. And I wish all my bandmates were contractors, and there's a lot of wishes there. But it's just an amazing space to walk into, because as soon as you walk into the doors of the studio, it's like you've teleported to somewhere else. It's just an amazing space. This is the live room looking towards that feature wall that we talked about. Mm-hmm. You can see the ceiling clouds there with the wood slats and the absorption in certain areas. Another view of the live room looking back towards the control room. Just an amazing space that so many people, when they walk in, Lauren has gotten used to the fact that he has this space, and now he's like, man, I sometimes forget how amazing it is until people walk in and they say, wow, this is another world. Another view of the live room looking into the control room.
The other call out on that too is now, like, you can see the mic plates for where all of that conduit was ran, and you can tell how important it is, because if that wasn't there, like if it was inside that wall or something, you're really in trouble after that concrete gets poured.
Exactly. It's something where you can see that one box here where we don't like to, again, recess it into the wall, but it also gives you the ability to easily access the mic plate from the backside. Mm-hmm. It gives you something to set something down on, like a capo or anything else. It's a nice little addition to the room, and something that sometimes people just don't think about.
Yeah.
Next slide here is the back wall of the control room is on the left photo, and then the ISO booth is on the right photo. Again, you see a mic plate there on the right side, some amps in there, soffit bass trapping in both. It's just like executed beautifully by him and his friends. And then this is the kind of the cockpit looking into the live room. And one thing I want to point out, and we mentioned this in the video, but the YouTube video of the tour of the space. But see that painting on the left-hand side? That's Lauren. Like, that's the owner of the studio. And he's a big fan of Dave Grohl. And Dave Grohl in his studio has this photo of himself painted, and he did it tongue-in-cheek. Just, it's ridiculous. He's got a smoking jacket on. He's got a beverage of choice there. He's got a framed photo of a Doberman Pinscher for some reason on the wall. And it's meant to be like, you walk into Dave's studio and it's like, man, this is ridiculous. Like, why do you have this?
Yeah.
And so Lauren's a big Dave Grohl fan, and I remember late in the process, he said, hey, I'm going to have my mom paint a portrait of me to hang in the studio like Dave Grohl has. And I feel bad. I think I doubted his mom a little bit, because I was like, is this going to be like this beautiful studio, and then there's like a stick figure drawing there of Lauren on the walls? And then Lauren told me a little bit about his mom and how good she is.
Yeah.
And I remember he sent me this photo here when the painting was done, and I was just like, that is phenomenal. Like, I mean, she is so talented. And he actually, I didn't know this until we filmed the video walkthrough of his space, that's actually a golfing trophy that he won, and also the jacket came with the tournament that he had won. And so it was kind of like a dig on his friends, and like, hey, but also just a tongue-in-cheek ridiculous aspect of the studio, which is pretty awesome. So kind of close-up view there. And I remember when he said he had his grand opening, it's in the corner of the live room there, and he had a curtain over top of it, and he did a grand reveal for everybody. And so
something like that, you have to.
Right, yeah, you can't just have it there without the big reveal. So, yeah, just an amazing space. I'll put up on the screen here if you're watching this on some platform where you can scan that QR code. That will take you to our YouTube page. You can watch the video in entirety. It's much more pristine than these photos that we showed throughout this podcast. But it is something where I'd like to show this case study, and if it's something that you guys are really interested in seeing more of these case studies, please comment below, or if there's projects of ours that you'd like us to cover, that would be great. And it's just really fun to kind of go back in the history. I mean, we're going back a decade now when we started this project, and to see it come to fruition is pretty awesome.
Yeah, it is.
So, well, thank you guys for being part of the S.O.U.N.D project, and we will see you next week.